morning. Assalamu alaikum. Namaskar to all of you. I think being the first speaker is good and bad in some ways. You get to set the tone, so that's a positive thing about it. And you're not repeating what someone else said because you're the first one. But at the same time, it's a big responsibility, and you are kind of setting the expectations for the rest of the day of the event. Let me take you through the BCM and ERM, the connection. And since it's the first session, I thought it's, I hope I'm audible. Yeah. So I thought it's good that we set the tone, understand the concepts. There are some misconceptions around the two terms which are being mentioned here. And this is through my experience when I've been talking to different people. That's where I've picked up these misconceptions from. So if you can go to the next slide. These are some of the things which people think of. These terms are many times used interchangeably, BCM and ERM. People feel they are one and the same. They are, in some cases, handled by separate teams. And by separate teams, I mean totally separate teams where the teams don't talk to each other or they compete with each other, which is also, again, a totally different approach. And these two teams are then working in silos. I've heard this comment that I have a very robust ERM. Why do I need BCM? What is BCM? So again, that's another approach which is what we have come across. Then there is the midway where BCM and ERM both coexist with some commonalities, some sharing of inputs. And again, we'll come to what probably is the right approach. And then what comes first, the chicken or the egg, whether BCM starts first and then ERM follows, or ERM starts first and then BCM follows, or they work in tandem. So we'll come to these specific things as we go along. So just as I said, to set the tone, to understand, because maybe some of you are experts in the field, maybe some of you have been working in either BCM or in ERM for some time, maybe some of you are very new to the field, but it's always good sometimes to go back to the basics, to understand what it really means and break down the definition to understand the concept better. So that's the definition of BCP as per Investopedia. And BCM, Business Continuity Management, is the approach or the overall methodology which is followed, which includes in it BCP and DRP. So BCP is a business continuity plan, DRP is a disaster recovery plan, and again, the two are not the same. So many times you see consultants or the auditors saying, do you have a BCP DRP? But BCP is different, DRP is different, the purpose is different. Yes, they are linked. They both come under BCM as the approach, but BCP is different and DRP is different. BCP or BCM as a whole, it encompasses people, process, technology, all the three major aspects of a business. And the key point is, how do you recover from a disaster? And then there are definitions of disaster, of course. So it's not that only fire and earthquake can be disasters. There are different disasters. So how do you recover from a disaster for that business? And how do you still continue doing the business at an acceptable level? So a disaster here is typically like in a human being, how you treat a life-threatening disease. So there are life-threatening diseases, people face it and come out of it, recover and come out of it. So that is exactly what we do in BCM. So BCM is the same thing for a company or a corporate. And below are the boxes. They just show the steps which are typically followed. There's a lot of jargon, but the business impact analysis, the RTOs and RPOs which have to be determined when you do a BCM, and that is what you do, whether it's DRP or it's BCP, you have to follow that approach. Then you prepare the actual plan, and then testing of the plan, and then maintenance of the plan. So that's the typical journey of a BCM, whether it's a BCP or the DRP. A DRP is typically the ITDR, where you are focusing more on the technology part, whereas BCP covers the people and the process part as well. Coming to the next slide, ERM, I'm sure most of you have seen this diagram, which is a typical diagram, the COSO framework and these things. ERM, Enterprise Risk Management, of course. That's the definition of Investopedia, which is there on the screen. It aims at every risk. So a company which claims to say that we follow an enterprise risk management approach, we look at all the risks facing our enterprise, then that necessarily means that the company is looking at the smallest of risks to the largest of risks. Very small, low, medium, high, catastrophic, all the risks have to be covered by the company if they have to claim that I'm having an ERM approach for my company. So that's the wide range of risks that get covered, and it has to cover across all locations, across all people, across all departments, across all elements of the business. So that's unlike the BCM again. And then the risk treatment. So of course, once you identify the risks, how do you treat the different risks? Those are the 4 typical manners in which you would treat the risk. Either you try to reduce the risk, putting preventive controls in place. You try to transfer the risk, like the insurances and things like that. You avoid the risk. Maybe there's some business which is very risky. You don't want to enter into that market. You avoid that risk. Or if something has to be done, you accept the risk. Because no risk, no business. No risk, no profit. So doing business itself means accepting risk. So it's just that you accept risk knowing how much risk you want to accept, what is your risk appetite. So that's typically the ERM framework and the ERM methodology when you follow it across the organization. Coming to the next slide. So since we are talking about the connection between ERM and BCM, it's also necessary to understand the subtle difference between the two. BCM is more tactical and ERM is more strategic. So why do we say that? Strategic means at the strategy level. So it has to have the top-down approach where the risk appetite is defined by the board, then management has the responsibility of implementing the framework, and then each person within the organization, right from the CEO to the lowest person, maybe even the office boys, for example, they have to know how they have to manage the risk in their particular area. So the ERM methodology or the approach is typically very strategic for the business, whereas BCM is tactical. And why do we say tactical is because that's more of war footing. You have to do something, because when a disaster strikes, you have to do something very immediately to recover and to continue the business. So that's something more tactical in nature. The focus in BCM, it is a business impact, because everything depends on if a disaster was to happen, what is going to be the business impact? How worst is my business going to be affected? And I have to come out of it unscathed. Whereas the ERM focus is typically the likelihood of risk. So how likely is this risk supposed to happen? And then what measures I want to take, whether I want to reduce it, whether I want to accept it, whether I want to transfer it, and the other things. So that's another thing. One is on the business impact, and the other one is on the likelihood of risk. This is required, BCM is required to be used when and only if a disaster strikes. And disaster definitions, as I said, can be different, but BCM you will need to use it, or a company will need to use it only if a disaster strikes. Whereas that's not the case in ERM. Every day, every second, every moment, whether during office hours or outside of office hours, each employee and even the third party which is connected with the company has to be part of the ERM and has to be doing something to manage the risks for that company or of that company business. The first one addresses risks that threaten the existence, and the other one addresses all types of risks that are affecting the business of the company. This is again how it needs to go hand in hand. So yes, we need to understand the difference between the two. On my first slide, as I had said that some companies, the two functions totally work in silos, or they even compete with each other as to whether BCM is better or ERM is better, but that's not the case. They have to go hand in hand, and it's only together that the organizational resilience can be built. If you see the two boxes at the bottom, so that kind of clearly explains ERM, as I said, has to be done on a daily basis, on a regular basis. BCM kicks in when ERM fails, and BCM has to kick in despite robust ERM. So in the first one, BCM kicks in where ERM fails for avoidable risks. So let's say there are two types of risks. Maybe the fires and earthquakes and the geopolitical related disasters, they are unavoidable risks, or they are not in control of the business itself. So those are the unavoidable risks. So if those kind of instances happen, then BCM has to kick in even if you have a robust ERM. So how much ever good your ERM may be, if an unavoidable risk was to happen, event was to happen, then your BCM will have to kick in at that point in time. Whereas there are some avoidable risks. And by avoidable risks, examples can be like, if I have only one customer, let's say, and the customer goes bankrupt. If I have only one supplier for my business, and the supplier stops his production line for some reason. So these are business-related decisions which can be easily avoidable. So if these avoidable risks are not managed well, then your ERM has failed. And if in that scenario, the disaster has to happen, like your sole customer goes bankrupt, or your sole supplier stops the production of their services or their products, then your ERM has failed. And that is also a disaster for the company, because that's going to threaten the existence of your business. In that case, also the BCM has to kick in. So both have to go hand in hand, and you cannot start thinking of a business continuity management strategy after the disaster strikes. Hence, one has to be ready with the BCM from day one. You have to know that if something was to happen, how I will address that. So that's clearly the difference, and that's why both have to go hand in hand. Just to put it again in a different way, BCM is a part of overall ERM. Because as I said, ERM looks after or addresses all your risks, very low, medium, high, catastrophic. And the catastrophic risks which are addressed in ERM have to be addressed by the BCM approach. So if you look at it that way, BCM has to be part of ERM, and ERM, a robust ERM, cannot be complete without having taken care of BCM. And how do you do BCM very effectively? By using the ERM methodology. So that's how they go so hand in hand. They cannot be thought of differently. But does it mean you should have an integrated function to look at it? No. The approach has to be integrated, but the functions have to be different. Why? Because the focus is different, the purpose is different, what you will do in BCM and in ERM will be different, but your approach has to be same. That is why it needs to have an integrated approach, but not an integrated function. As I said, they have, approach has to be same, but focus and scope are different. And together, when you have both the things together, only then you can ensure the sustainability of the business or the organization. Thank you very much. I hope I've set the tone. Any questions now or later are most welcome from any side. So when you say risk, I think, okay, for the advantage of everyone, the gentleman here, he asked about how to minimize the risk, the avoidable risk, unavoidable risks, right? So unavoidable risks, again, there is a likelihood of that happening and the impact of that. So likelihood, it's something which is not in control of the organization and hence cannot be changed, but the impact of that could be reduced. Like for example, a fire happening, the impact of that would be reduced if you have all the fire fighting mechanisms and evacuation plans and all those things in place, then the impact of that can be reduced. But typically unavoidable risks are those where they are beyond the control of that business. It depends on what risk specifically that you're talking about. For example, let's say earthquake, okay, or geopolitical risks. So yes, you can minimize the impact of that by, let's say, diversifying your business into different locations, different geopolitical areas where probably the risk gets distributed at least. If not minimized, you could distribute the risk. Earthquake, let's say, earthquake is totally out of the control of any business to control. But then probably if your company operations are on a fault zone, fault line, you could be shifting to a more safer location. So yes, you could reduce some part of it, but the instance itself happening is beyond the control of the company as an individual company. So that's where we call it an unavoidable risk.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ashwini, for your informative presentation on the BCM and ERM. I just have one, I don't know if it's a question or inquiries, but can we take incidents, that happens, so incident-based, risk as a risk. So it's not because when you defined it, you said it's the likelihood of happening. So sometimes we do, in the operations of a business, we do face with incidents, and the severity of incidents varies. So some of these risks, can we take incidents as a risk when we do our risk assessment? Thank you.
Incidents as a risk? Sorry, I didn't get it.
You know, like let's say, you know, in an organizations where you have, can we give the, you know, the hacking or security,
Yes.
the cyber security. So that's an incident.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we do a regular risk assessment,
Yes.
can we take it from the incidence perspective or only the likelihood? Because this is what I wanted just to make.
Hacking, to me,
That's an example I
yes,
gave
yes.
only. It
So
could be a leaking, it could be, you know, again, any other things. You know, the pandemic, the whole COVID
Yes.
made a disruptions in our
Yes.
all institutions, yeah?
Yes, yes.
So that was, again, it's not incidents, but it was a catastrophic throughout the
Yes.
globe, yeah?
Yes.
So I just gave that as an example. Thank you.
Right, right. No, so, and specifically picking up on that example also, one would look at that event happening, like a hacking happening, it is an incident, but that will have to be, so you will have to again put in all the preventive controls, measures, and plus the risk transfer. So that's where the cyber insurance probably comes in place. But it will have to start from, so all the 4 aspects of managing the risk will have to be addressed. It is an incident and it will have to be treated as an incident. Any risk event, so something which depends on something happening out of the ordinary, then that's an incidence. Something which is your regular business operations and it could go wrong, that's probably more of a process failure. But if something external happens which affects your business, that I would typically call it as an incident or incidents which is affecting which is causing a risk, which could be having an impact. I hope I answered your question.
Hi, and thank you for your presentation. Okay. I have a question regarding the linkage of BCM and disaster recovery plan. When do you say that you stop the BCM and start the disaster recovery? Like for instance, if I have a station and an incident happened that requires you to stop and you cannot continue business by any means possible. So how do you identify whether this, now we apply the BCM or we shift right into DRP? And if there are 2 separate teams, is there a way to set a governance tone and, well, the stoppage of someone's role in the interfering of the other? And yeah, how do you combine both or how do you separate both?
Okay, so if I get you right, your question is more on the BCM or the BCP maybe and the DRP, right? So as I said earlier, BCM is the approach that you would follow, the methodology which you would follow to make your plan, which will include the IT disaster recovery plan and which will also include your business continuity plan. Now when an event or a disaster happens, at that time, first thing you have to do is to recover from that. So if there is a damage, you have to recover from that damage and then you have to continue your basic business, the critical operations, the critical processes of the business which are bare minimum required to ensure that the business is able to continue. So it will depend on every business how much time you take to recover from that, and the RTOs and RPOs, the recovery time objective which you would have defined to decide within how much time you want to recover, that will also be a guiding force to decide. Maybe I'm saying if it's a bank, let's say, I will not be able to afford even 1 minute of delay in the operations to start by. Maybe if it's some other business, probably you could live with 1 day business not being operating, let's say. So that will be guiding as to how much time you have to recover, how much time you don't mind losing, because any methodology to be put in, any plan to be put in, it will come at a cost. And I think the one part of your question is when do you go back to the normal function, normal operations? That is what you meant, right? So I think that will again depend on the disaster that has happened. So if a disaster has affected your IT systems, let's say, like a hacking incident, then you will have to go back to your normal function when all your IT systems and things have been recovered back to normalcy and you are able to function at the full force. So it will depend on what measures you have put in place, how much you have invested, and how soon you want it to be recovered and to be back to normal. So it's not a clear answer, but it will all be defined in the planning stage itself, because what is acceptable to your business? Can I really be in the disaster mode or the safe mode, as they say, safe mode for 1 month? Maybe my business can afford it, so I invest less in the plan itself, in implementing the plan itself. So it will depend business to business, but that will be defined in that company's plan as to within how much time I want to be back to normal. And the sooner I want to be back to normal, I would be spending typically more on getting the plan in place.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for your presentation. I just have a question regarding the documentation for business continuity. It is proper to have like a business continuity plan which include inside it business impact analysis and recovery strategy, because it's linked at the end. You define the impact or the risk in a specific function, and then you define the way how to recover if something happened to this. So my question is, what's the most professional way to reporting BCM or business continuity plan?
To document the plan, you
document
to document the plan. So documentation is important.
Or the structure of business continuity plan. It can be like a business impact analysis included in the document, same document with the recovery strategy, or there is another way of reporting.
Okay. So there are two purposes of documenting a plan, or any documentation for that matter. One is you need to have the steps handy when you have to implement it. Like in the disaster event, you want to know exactly what steps to follow, who should follow that step, what are the contact numbers, all those things. So that's the action plan. Another purpose of any documentation is the maintenance and continuity of that process itself. So for example, I want to also learn as a company, I want to learn from my own BCM, my BCP. In the event of a disaster, what really happened? What was the business impact analysis I had done at that time? Why I decided that this is the method I will adopt? So all that has to be documented in the overall BCM documentation. Now, whether it has to be the same document, whether the business impact analysis has to be shared with everyone in the company, no. So that's where you can decide which portions are meant for whose eyes. The actions to be taken have to be shared with the people who are supposed to do the actions. They should know what I'm supposed to do if a disaster happens, what my role will be if a disaster was to strike, or depending on what disaster strikes. But documentation is definitely necessary. It needs to be there. And probably the BCM team will have to have the complete documentation of the approach which was followed, because that's when they will be able to revise the approach, maintain it current for the latest situation, amend it as and when there are changes in the business environment. So the documentation has to be complete with all those aspects. Whom you share with which parts of that document, that will depend on the need-to-know basis. The need-to-know rule will have to be applied for that. All right, so thank you very much. Thank you.